Good morning. I'm Dana Taylor, in for Taylor Wilson, and today is Saturday, September 13th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, we'll hear how the White House has been mourning the death of Charlie Kirk. In Chicago, an ICE agent is injured and a man is dead after a traffic stop. And new inflation numbers are out. What do they say about the economy? The suspect in the fatal shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk is in custody on a murder charge. Authorities said they tied the suspect to the crime through a review of online messages, interviews with his family and friends, and surveillance video. Charlie Kirk was killed by a single gunshot on Wednesday, September 10th, while speaking at Utah Valley University. The conservative influencer's widow, Erica Kirk, spoke publicly about her husband's killing for the first time on Friday, vowing to continue his mission. The White House has been in mourning following the assassination of Kirk, a close friend of both President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Kirk was a figure whose influence reached deep inside the administration. I spoke with USA Today White House reporter Francesca Chambers to talk about the grief, the politics, and what Kirk's death means in this moment for the White House. Francesca, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, Dana.
Francesca, this is a White House in deep mourning over the tragic death of Charlie Kirk. I know that you've spent a lot of time covering the White House. How has Kirk's death affected the White House staff?
White House aides are in agony, and the president and vice president have spoken out about this publicly too. The vice president in a very long tribute to Kirk on X, and the president, he spoke about this both on True Social and then in an interview on Fox and Friends, where he just talked about the shock that when he found out that Charlie Kirk had been shot and then later found out that he had died. And the vice president in his X post talked about, what a close friend and confidant that Charlie Kirk had been for him. But White House aides have also been public about this, about just the shock and the deep pain and grief that they have been experiencing. Many of the younger White House staffers, they came up through Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, which has a large presence on college campuses around the country, and credit that to how they got involved with President Donald Trump's White House, how they were involved with the conservative movement.
Both President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance were close with Charlie Kirk, as you've described. On a personal level, how are they grappling with their loss?
Yes, and I should also add that the president's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., was also really close with Charlie Kirk. He said in his own social media post that Kirk was like a little brother to him. And Kirk and Donald Trump Jr. were both responsible for getting Vice President J.D. Vance on the ticket. They were two of the biggest backers of Vance getting on Donald Trump's ticket in 2024. And Vance himself noted that in his social media post where he talked about Kirk and his relationship with him. He also noted that Kirk was one of the first people he called when he decided to run for the United States Senate. And then he went on to win that Ohio Senate seat before he was tapped to be vice president. And he said that Kirk texted him and checked in on him and his family pretty regularly during that time. Now, when it comes to President Trump, he said in his Fox and Friends interview that he couldn't watch the video of Charlie Kirk being killed and that was not how he wanted to remember him.
Vance in particular had a close relationship with Kirk. Tell us more about that.
So, Dana, they were close friends. They were also close political allies. I actually spoke to Charlie Kirk a few months ago when I first started writing about Vice President Vance for USA Today for an article, a profile that I did on the vice president. And he was and continued to be one of his biggest boosters. He wanted to see Vance run for president in 2028. He said at the time that he thought that Vance's stock was ascendant. He said at the time, I'm all in for JD for whatever he wants in the future. And it was also really notable at the time, though, that when I talked to him about the relationship, he didn't want to say that he was a confidant or even portray himself as overly close with the vice president. I think, I got the sense at the time that he didn't want to overstate the relationship, but the vice president himself said after the fact, in that X post that we're talking about, just what a confidant he was, and that everything that he would tell him, would always stay between the two of them.
Francesca, we of course saw that closeness with the vice president and Air Force Two.
On September 11th, the day after Charlie Kirk was killed, Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife, Usha, flew to Utah to pick up Charlie Kirk's casket, as well as his widow, Erica, and to pay his respects to the family and close friends of Charlie Kirk. And then he flew them in Air Force Two to Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the things that was so striking about the moment when they landed was that Erica, Charlie Kirk's widow, walked off the plane first with Usha Vance, and then it was the vice president who followed a few steps behind, when typically what you see with both the president and vice president when they land anywhere is they're usually the ones who deplane first. But that's not what we saw here. And I think it does speak to the closeness with which the vice president and his family had with Charlie Kirk and his family, and the deference and respect that he paid them.
Francesca Chambers is a White House correspondent for USA Today. Thank you for taking the time with me today, Francesca.
Thanks, Dana.
A U.S. Marine has been fired over a social media post mocking the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. The Pentagon says it's tracking posts from service members and has zero tolerance for any that celebrate Kirk's death. Screenshots circulating online showed a Marine recruiter posting, quote, "Another racist man popped." Right-wing influencers quickly amplified the message and demanded his removal. The Marine Corps confirms the member was relieved of duty and placed under investigation. Other posts, including one from a teacher in the military school system, have also drawn scrutiny, with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth calling such comments, quote, "completely unacceptable," end quote, and he warns that disciplinary action is coming. The State Department has gone further, saying foreign nationals who glorify Kirk's killing are not welcome in the U.S. Federal immigration agents shot and killed a man in suburban Chicago following an attempted arrest. Officials say 45-year-old Silverio Villegas Gonzalez resisted and dragged an ICE agent with his car. That agent is recovering in stable condition. The Department of Homeland Security says Villegas Gonzalez was the target of a vehicle stop tied to a criminal investigation, and that the officer followed training in using force. But critics are raising concerns. His attorney says Villegas Gonzalez's prior offenses were traffic-related, reckless driving, speeding, and operating without insurance, and he's calling for a full investigation. The fatal shooting comes just a week into Operation Midway Blitz, President Trump's crackdown on immigration enforcement in Chicago. Inflation ticked up in August, but the bigger story may be what's happening in the job market. Rising unemployment claims, consumer cutbacks, and questions about whether the Federal Reserve will cut rates are all shaping the economic picture. I caught up with USA Today's Andrea Riccier to break down what these signals mean for Americans and for the Fed's next move. Andrea, thank you as always for coming on.
My pleasure.
Inflation ticked up to 2.9% in August. What's behind that increase, and what does that mean for everyday Americans?
When we talk about inflation, what we're talking about is the government measuring a bunch of goods and services that hopefully represent sort of what the average American is buying and using over the course of a month. And so all those things together were 2.9% costlier than a year ago in August. Core inflation is a way of looking at that whole big basket, but taking out food and energy, both of which tend to be really volatile categories of spending. So it's just a little bit more consistent way of measuring inflation. So core inflation was the same as a year ago as it was in July, but all-in inflation was just a little bit higher. And so this is both good news and bad news. It's good news in the sense that inflation is not runaway. It's not super high the way it was a couple years ago. And it's also good that it's a little more consistent month to month. But with that said, 3%-ish is still a lot higher than the Fed wants it to be. The Fed has a 2% target.
The Federal Reserve has been under pressure from the Trump administration to lower interest rates, but the high rates are intended to curb inflation. With this uptick, how could the Federal Reserve craft its next move?
So it's an interesting question that we're talking about inflation because at the moment, it seems like a lot of analysts think the Fed is going to really focus more on the jobs picture. And what that means is paying more attention to what seems to be a pretty rapidly deteriorating job market when the Fed meets next week. The job situation has seemed okay, despite a lot of talk about the effects of tariffs for a couple months, a lot of other things going on in the economy. But just in the past week or so, it seems like things have deteriorated. A lot of people also think and hope that the Fed will try to ignore political pressure and just focus on its mandate of controlling inflation, but also supporting the job market.
You highlight that jobless claims have hit a 4-year high, and there's record low confidence in finding new work. How much weight do these labor signals carry compared to the inflation data in pushing the Fed toward rate cuts?
So the Fed often talks about having a dual mandate, two parts of the mandate, both inflation and the jobs picture, sort of carry equal weight for them. But as I said a moment ago, it just seems like the inflation is under control enough, whereas the job market situation is sort of seems to be coming out of nowhere, taking a lot of people by surprise. And a lot of people are saying things like that gives the Fed cover, to sort of turn its attention to the job market and enact maybe one rate cut for now, see if that sends a signal to people who would be hiring, sends a signal to people who might be thinking about laying people off, and says, we stand ready to support the economy however we can.
Andrew, you noted rising car repossessions, people cutting back on fast food, and rising coffee prices. From your reporting, how are these pressures playing out for consumers in ways that may not show up in the headlines of economic reports?
It kind of feels like there have been a lot of early warning signs that things are not going well in the economy that just aren't showing up yet in official data. So, for example, if coffee is more expensive, people may switch to a cheaper brand. You're not going to see a big ripple through the economy from that. If you're McDonald's and people are eating less fast food, you may see that. And a lot of what we have on people's behavior is actually coming from hearing earnings calls from companies like McDonald's over the past couple weeks. But, we haven't yet seen that hit official data. The question is, will we? Whether or not the Fed does put through a rate cut next week, are things deteriorating enough such that we will see more signs of consumer distress? And if we see signs of consumer distress and consumers start to pull back, then you start to see layoffs, and that becomes sort of a vicious cycle in the economy. We don't know. Time will tell. There were a lot of analysts predicting a recession a couple years ago, and that didn't come to pass. So, I want to be very wary of not sounding too alarmist, but there are definitely warning signals.
Markets seem bullish with the S&P 500 and Nasdaq both at record highs. How are investors balancing that optimism with the underlying uncertainty in both the job market and inflation, especially given the uncertainty around tariffs?
I think that right now markets are really looking forward to lower borrowing costs, and a Fed rate cut really trumps everything. The big question is, where do we go after the Fed's September meeting? And we'll just have to see.
Andrea Riccier is a reporter with USA Today. Andrea, again, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Tomorrow on The Excerpt, conservative activist Charlie Kirk was shot dead while speaking at an event in Utah. His assassination has shaken Washington and raised fears that political violence in America is entering a new and dangerous phase. USA Today national reporter Will Carless joins The Excerpt from the ground to explain why violence against political figures is rising and whether this marks a turning point for U.S. democracy. Listen to that conversation starting at 5 a.m. Eastern. Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. We're produced by Kaylee Monahan with the help of our network of newsroom reporters. Our executive producer is Laura Beatty. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio. And if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor, filling in for Taylor Wilson. We'll be back tomorrow with more of USA Today's The Excerpt.